My name's Ethan. I'm 26 and I work as a graphic designer. Honestly, I've never been the kind of guy to believe in ghost stories or weird supernatural stuff. But what happened to me a few months ago changed everything. I'm about to tell you something that still haunts me. Something I wish I had never been curious enough to investigate. You see, there's this house next to mine. Ordinary from the outside, but there's always been something off about it. People around here talk about this room inside that's always sealed. A room no one can open, no matter how hard they try. And now, looking back, I know why. I shouldn't have gone in there. But when my neighbor disappeared, I felt like I had to know the truth. Little did I know the truth would almost cost me my soul. It all started when my neighbor, Mr. Johnson, stopped showing up. At first I didn't think much of it. People go on trips, right? But after a week of seeing his mail pile up and noticing his car hadn't moved, something clicked. It was strange, and honestly, I felt this gut feeling telling me something was wrong. That's when I remembered the stories about the house. Everyone in the neighborhood had mentioned the room, this one door inside that had been locked for years. Mr. Johnson had even joked about it once, saying he'd tried everything to open it, but it was like it was cursed. I never thought much about it until now. Curiosity started eating away at me, and I had to figure out what was really going on. And that's how it all began. I kept telling myself I wouldn't get involved. I mean, it wasn't really my business. But one night, I heard something strange coming from Mr. Johnson's house. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was just lying in bed when I heard this weird noise. It wasn't like footsteps or anything. It was more like whispering, but muffled, almost as if it was coming from behind a wall. That was it for me. The next day, I walked over to his house. The front door was slightly ajar. My heart raced. Should I go inside? I mean, this was crazy, right? But something, maybe it was that same curiosity, pushed me forward. The house was dark and empty. Everything was in its place, but there was a thick layer of dust everywhere, like no one had been there for weeks. As I walked through the hallway, my eyes kept drifting to the door at the end of the hall, the one everyone talked about, the locked room. I felt drawn to it, like something was pulling me closer, daring me to open it. But of course the door wouldn't budge. I jiggled the handle, pushed, and even tried forcing it open with my shoulder, but it stayed shut, just like everyone said it would. That's when I heard it again. That faint whispering, coming from the other side of the door. I froze. My mind screamed at me to get out of there, but my body wouldn't move. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at that door. And then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whispers, like they were following me, trying to get inside my head. By morning, I knew I couldn't just ignore it anymore. Something was seriously wrong with that house, and I had to find out what it was. I told myself I'd just check on things one more time, make sure Mr. Johnson wasn't in some kind of trouble. But deep down, I knew I was more curious about that locked room than anything else. So the next day, I walked over again. This time, the door was wide open. I stepped inside. The air felt heavy, thicker than it should have been. I started walking through the house, half expecting Mr. Johnson to jump out and scare the hell out of me. But no one was there, just that same unsettling silence. My heart pounded as I made my way to the end of the hallway where that locked door stood. But something was different this time. The door was slightly ajar. It didn't make sense. I had tried everything to open that door the day before, and now it was just open, like it had been waiting for me. I could feel my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. Every instinct screamed for me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know what was behind it. I pushed the door open, and what I saw inside made my stomach drop. It wasn't a normal room. The walls, the floor, everything was covered in this strange dark mist, like a shadow had come to life and swallowed the entire space. And then, in the middle of the room, I saw a faint light, flickering like a dying flame. I stepped closer, and the whispers returned, louder, clearer this time, like they were surrounding me. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and I realized I wasn't alone. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, but no one was there. At least no one I could see. The whispers were coming from all directions, growing louder, more frantic. It was like 100 voices all talking at once, begging for something. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't move. Then I saw them. Shadows moving along the walls. Shapes of people. They weren't fully formed, just outlines. But I could feel their presence, like they were reaching out to me. That's when I realized these weren't just shadows. They were the souls of the people who had lived here before, trapped. I stepped back, my mind racing. How had I gotten into this? How was I supposed to get out? I felt like I was drowning in the darkness, like it was pulling me deeper into some kind of nightmare. And then, through the chaos, I heard a voice, clearer than the rest. It wasn't whispering. It was warning me. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, soft but urgent. "They're all trapped, and now they want you too." Panic surged through me. I had to get out, but the door was gone, swallowed by the shadows. I was stuck. That's when I remembered. I had my phone in my pocket. I grabbed it and started recording, hoping that if I didn't make it out, someone would find this and understand what happened. "Listen, if you're watching this right now," I whispered into the camera, my voice shaking. "Please, make sure to subscribe and like this video, because I don't know if I'll ever get out of here." I could barely hold the phone steady as the shadows closed in on me, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I looked around, trying to find anything that could help me escape. There had to be a way out. There had to be. That's when I saw it, a faint crack in the far corner of the room where the wall met the floor. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was something, my only chance. I didn't have time to think. I shoved the phone into my pocket and ran toward the crack, ignoring the feeling of cold hands trying to grab me, pull me back into the darkness. As I got closer, I could see it was more than just a crack. It was like a door, but not quite. More like a tear in the very fabric of the room. Beyond it, I could see something. Light. It was faint, but it was there. A sign that maybe, just maybe, I could still make it out alive. I dropped to my knees and tried to force my way through the crack, pulling at the edges, making it wider. The shadows were right behind me now, their cold fingers brushing against my back. I pushed harder, and the tear finally gave way, opening just enough for me to crawl through. With one last effort, I threw myself into the light, leaving the whispers and shadows behind. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. I don't know how long I lay there on the floor, gasping for breath, my heart racing. When I finally looked up, I was back in the hallway of Mr. Johnson's house. The door to the room was shut tight, just like it had been before. The whispers were gone. The shadows disappeared. Everything was normal again, or as normal as it could be after what I had just experienced. I stood up on shaky legs and stumbled toward the front door. I needed to get out of that house, away from whatever nightmare I had stepped into. As soon as I was outside, I slammed the door shut and ran back to my place. I didn't stop until I was inside, locked up and sitting on my couch, still trying to catch my breath. The next morning, I went back to check on Mr. Johnson's house. The front door was closed. There was no sign that anything had happened. No sign of Mr. Johnson. It was like the house had swallowed him whole, just like all those other people before him. I thought about calling the police, telling them everything, but what would I say? That I had been pulled into some kind of nightmare and barely made it out alive? I never saw Mr. Johnson again, and I never went back inside that house. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear those whispers. Faint, but there, like they're waiting for me to come back. And I know one thing for sure. There's no way in hell I'm ever going near that room again. My name is Mark, I'm 28, and I work as a software developer. You could say I'm pretty logical, not the type to believe in ghosts or weird paranormal stuff. But after what happened to me and my wife, I don't think I'll ever look at the world the same way again. Before I dive into the details, let me just say this. If I had known what was waiting for us in that house, I would have turned around and never set foot in the neighborhood. But we didn't know, and that's why I'm here, telling you a story that'll make you think twice before you move somewhere new. It all started a few months ago when my wife, Emma, and I moved into what we thought was the perfect house. Quiet street, nice neighbors, or so we thought. Everything seemed normal except for the guy next door. No noise, not a single sound, day or night. At first, it seemed like a blessing. A quiet neighbor. What could be better, right? But after a few days, it started feeling unnatural. Like, how could anyone live their life and never make a sound? Emma even joked, saying, maybe he's a ghost or something. We laughed it off, but deep down it didn't feel quite right. And trust me, it wasn't. The first night we heard it, I thought it was just the house settling. You know, the kind of noises old houses make when the temperature drops. Creaks, groans, nothing unusual. But then the sounds got weirder. Metallic creaking, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor, and these muffled whispers. Emma heard it too. We both woke up at the same time, sitting up in bed, listening. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, gripping my arm. I nodded, my heart beating a little faster. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to convince myself more than her. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. Every night the noises came back, always from the same direction, the neighbor's house. Emma wanted to ignore it, but I couldn't. The more I heard it, the more curious I got. Who was this guy? What could possibly be making those sounds? And why was it only at night? We decided to check things out just to ease our minds. The next night, I convinced Emma we needed to get a closer look. It wasn't that I was scared. Well, maybe a little. But more than anything, I needed to understand what was going on. Curiosity had me hooked. We waited until it got dark, and then quietly slipped out of the house. The cool night air brushed against our skin as we crossed the yard, staying low behind the bushes. From a distance, the neighbor's house looked as dead as ever. No lights, no movement. But those sounds, the creaking and faint whispers, were still there, barely audible but unmistakable. We crept up to the side of the house, careful not to make any noise. I motioned for Emma to stay back while I got closer to one of the windows. Through a tiny crack in the blinds, I could see into the living room. Nothing strange, just a basic setup like anyone else's home. But then, something caught my eye. A dim light coming from the basement. I turned back to Emma, who was crouched by the hedge, her eyes wide. "There's something in the basement," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. She nodded, clearly just as intrigued and freaked out as I was. "I think we should come back during the day," she whispered back, but I could tell she was curious too. It was one of those moments where you know you should walk away, but something pulls you in deeper. And that's exactly what happened to us. The next day, we couldn't stop thinking about it. What was down there? Who was this guy? And why was he so secretive? I don't know why, but I convinced Emma we should check it out again. This time, during the day. Around noon, we made our way back, acting casual, like we were just out for a walk. We circled around to the side of the house, hoping no one would see us. That's when we spotted it, a small, dirty window leading into the basement. I wiped the dust off with my sleeve, leaned in, and that's when I saw them. At first, I thought they were mannequins, bizarre, lifelike mannequins just sitting there in the basement. But something was off. They were too real, too human. And then, one of them moved. It was slight, just a twitch, but enough to make my heart stop. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. "Emma," I hissed, "you've got to see this." She peered through the window and I could see the horror in her face. We stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The figures inside seemed too real, almost like they were breathing. Before I could say anything else, Emma whispered, "Mark, maybe we should tell someone. And honestly, if you're watching this right now, make sure you hit that subscribe button and like this video." Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for what happens next. We ran back to our house, our minds spinning. What were those things? They couldn't be real people, right? The idea was too insane to even consider. But deep down, we both knew something was horribly wrong. We debated for hours, trying to decide what to do. Call the police? Confront the neighbor? Every option seemed too dangerous or too absurd. That night, the noises returned, louder than ever before. The metallic creaking sounded like it was coming from inside our own house. We barely slept, and when the sun finally came up, we knew we had to do something. We couldn't live like this anymore. We decided to confront the neighbor. Armed with nothing but our phones, we marched over and knocked on his door. No answer. We knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. Against our better judgment, we stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, just like always. We called out, but no one answered. I motioned for Emma to follow me as we made our way toward the basement door. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly pushed it open. The creaking of the old hinges echoed through the house, and the cold, damp air from below hit us like a wall. We descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The basement was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb, casting long shadows across the room. And there they were, the mannequins, or whatever they were, sitting exactly where we had seen them before. But now they looked different. Their eyes were open. Emma gasped, clutching my arm as we stared in disbelief. These weren't mannequins. They were people, silent, unmoving, but somehow alive. And then from the darkest corner of the room, we heard it, a slow, heavy breathing. The neighbor stepped out of the shadows, his face calm, almost serene. "I see you've met my collection," he said softly. "They never make a sound, but they're always watching." We didn't wait to hear more. We bolted up the stairs and out of that house, slamming the door behind us. We never looked back. The next day, we packed our things and moved as far away as we could. I still don't know what those things were or what he was doing to them. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear those metallic creaks, and I wonder if they followed us.
Sometimes, the past doesn't just haunt people, it curses them. And if you stick around, you'll see exactly what I mean. My name is Noah. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a construction manager. I've lived in the same quiet neighborhood for as long as I can remember. But let me tell you, this place isn't as peaceful as it looks. Today, I'm about to share a story that still sends shivers down my spine. And if you think it's all just in my head, I challenge you to come here and see for yourself. The house right next to mine used to belong to a family that everyone knew for all the wrong reasons. The father was a raging alcoholic, a man whose booming voice could turn the warmest day cold. He was aggressive, and his temper was a hurricane. His wife, the poor woman, was the target of his wrath. Their 3 sons, barely teenagers at the time, grew up in a home filled with fights, slammed doors, and the constant smell of cheap whiskey. It seemed inevitable that something terrible would happen. But it didn't come in the way we expected. No, it was much, much worse. As the years passed, the boys grew tired of the chaos. They couldn't take the beatings, the screaming, or the shattered glass anymore. By the time they reached adulthood, each of them made the decision to leave, one after the other. They said their goodbyes to their mother, promising to visit. But I think we all knew they were just running as far away from the nightmare as possible. Then, 3 years after the last son moved out, something happened that I'll never forget. The old man, their father, finally drank himself into his grave. It was a stormy Friday night, the kind of night where the wind feels like it's whispering secrets. He stumbled into their living room, clutching a bottle, and collapsed onto that old, ratty sofa where he spent most of his miserable days. By morning, he was dead. The whole neighborhood buzzed with the news. The funeral was a sad affair, with just a few family members and curious neighbors attending. The sons returned home, and for a brief moment, it seemed like things would finally get better. They moved back in with their mother, trying to help her pick up the pieces of a shattered life. But you know how they say history has a way of repeating itself? Yeah, well, I started to notice something disturbing. The eldest son, who had once been the responsible, level-headed one, began to change. He became aggressive, just like his father. And that's when things took a dark turn. Was it destiny? Or was something more sinister at play? You'll have to decide for yourself. Oh, and by the way, if you're intrigued so far and wanted to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Trust me, there's a lot more to this tale that you won't want to miss. It didn't take long for the darkness to settle back into that house. The eldest son, who used to be the protector of his brothers, slowly became a twisted shadow of himself. I watched from my porch as he staggered home, slurring his words and yelling obscenities into the night. It was almost as if his father's spirit had crept into his body, taking over every decent part of him. He picked up the same habits his father had, drinking, yelling, and even lashing out at his mother. I'd hear her cries through my thin bedroom walls, and it felt like history was repeating itself right before my eyes. One cold December night, the neighborhood was shaken by a familiar sound of glass bottle shattering, followed by a door slamming. I knew what was coming, but I didn't expect it to happen so soon. The eldest son stumbled into the same living room where his father had died, gripping a bottle of whiskey like a lifeline. He collapsed onto that cursed sofa, muttering to himself. By morning, he was dead. Dead in the same exact spot, in the same horrifying way as his father. People started talking. Neighbors whispered about the curse of the sofa, as if it had soaked up years of violence and misery, now waiting to claim its next victim. It was becoming more than just a coincidence. It was a nightmare that no one could wake up from. The second son, who had tried so hard to keep his distance from the chaos, couldn't escape the pull of that house. After his brother's funeral, I saw the change in him too. He was quieter, more reserved, but I could see the struggle behind his eyes, like he was fighting something invisible, something inescapable. He started drinking, just a little at first. I'd catch glimpses of him sitting on the front porch, taking long, tired sips from a bottle. It was almost like the house was whispering to him, drawing him into its poisonous embrace. His temper flared up, and before long, he was yelling at his mother, slamming doors, and throwing things across the room. One rainy evening, I was coming back from work when I heard it, the gut-wrenching sound of a bottle breaking and a scream that made my blood run cold. The second son had fallen victim to the same terrible fate. He stumbled into the house, drenched from the storm, and collapsed onto the same old sofa. Just like his father and brother, he never got up. By now, I was terrified. How could three men from the same family die in the exact same way, in the same cursed spot? Was it bad luck, or was there something more sinister at work? Everyone in the neighborhood was on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. By the time the third and youngest son took up residence in that cursed house, the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. We were all exhausted from the cycle of grief and fear, but we couldn't look away. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, horrifying, but impossible to ignore. The youngest son had always been the quiet, artistic type. He'd managed to escape his father's shadow for a long time, but the house seemed determined to break him too. I noticed him sitting on the front steps more often, a cigarette in one hand and a bottle in the other. The same sadness and anger that had taken his brothers now clung to him, dragging him down day by day. And then it happened. Late one summer night, I heard the unmistakable sound of shattering glass once more. I raced to my window, my heart pounding in my chest. The youngest son had stumbled into the living room, clutching his chest as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He made it to the sofa, the cursed center of this family's tragedy, and collapsed. By morning, he was gone, claimed by the same fate as his father and brothers. The mother was now alone, a shell of the woman she had once been. The house, once filled with the chaos of life, was now silent, echoing only with the ghosts of a broken family. Rumors about a curse continued to spread, but no one dared go near that place. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear whispers coming from that living room, like echoes of the past refusing to fade. Was it just a series of terrible coincidences? Or was there something truly evil, lurking within those walls, feeding on the sorrow and pain of that family? I still don't know. Even now, when I walk past that house, I can't help but shiver, feeling like 1,000 eyes are watching me. And if you ever find yourself in my neighborhood, you might want to take a detour around that place. Because sometimes, the past doesn't just haunt it curses.
My name is David, I'm 32 years old, and I work as a freelance graphic designer. I live a pretty normal life, at least I did until a few months ago. You know, I always thought of myself as a guy who could handle anything. But what I'm about to tell you still haunts me to this day. It all started when a new neighbor moved in next door. Now I know what you're thinking. What could be so scary about that? Well, let's just say by the time I realized the truth about him, it was almost too late. But I'll get to that part soon enough. My wife Sarah and I had lived in this quiet suburban neighborhood for a couple of years. We knew most of the people around here, so it was strange when someone moved into the house next to ours and didn't even bother introducing himself. At first we brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just shy or had a lot going on. But then things started to get weird. Every night, we heard these odd scraping noises coming from his garage. It was like someone dragging something heavy across the floor, but the sound always stopped if we tried to get closer to the window. Sarah asked me if I thought we should check it out, but honestly, I didn't want to get involved. Maybe he was just fixing something in there. No big deal, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I should have trusted that instinct. One night I got up to grab a glass of water, and as I glanced out the window, I saw him, our neighbor, standing by his garage window, staring right at our house. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and his face didn't have any expression. Just blank. It sent chills down my spine. I told Sarah, and she freaked out. She wanted to call the cops, but what could we say? Hey, our neighbor was looking at us from his window. That didn't seem like enough for the police to show up, so we decided to keep an eye on things ourselves. A few nights later, I noticed something else. I was outside, checking the yard, when I saw a figure move in the shadows. My heart jumped. I froze for a second, then quietly stepped toward the noise. I could have sworn someone was in our yard. I grabbed my phone to check the cameras, and sure enough, a dark shape had passed by, too fast to make out, but definitely there. I didn't sleep much that night. The weirdest part? Every time I looked out, I saw the neighbor's garage light flickering on and off like he was doing something in there, something he didn't want us to see. The next day, I ran into our neighbor across the street, Gene. He's lived in this neighborhood for years and usually knows what's going on. I decided to ask him if he had noticed anything strange about the guy next door. Gene's face changed the moment I brought it up. "You've heard the noises too, huh?" he asked, his voice low. I didn't want to mention it, but yeah, something's definitely off with that guy. Last night I could have sworn I heard someone crying. Not like loud crying, but you know, the kind of muffled sobbing that makes your skin crawl. Hearing this gave me chills. I told him about what Sarah and I had been experiencing, and it felt like the pieces were starting to fall into place. It wasn't just in our heads. Something was seriously wrong with our neighbor. Gene wasn't the kind of guy to spook easily, but even he seemed uneasy. He asked if we should call the police, but I still wasn't sure what to say. All we had were weird noises and shadows in the yard. I told him we should keep watching, and if things got worse, we'd call. Gene agreed, but I could tell he was just as creeped out as I was. That evening, as Sarah and I sat down to talk about everything, she suggested, "You know, David, maybe we should record what's been happening and share it online. I bet other people have gone through something like this." She looked at me seriously. "And hey, if you're watching this right now, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Trust me, You're going to want to stay updated on this one. It felt a little odd to say that in the middle of such a creepy situation, but she was right. Maybe sharing this could help others. But then, as quickly as all the strange events had started, they stopped. One morning, I looked out the window and noticed something odd. Our neighbor's van was gone. Not just moved, but completely gone. His house was dark, the garage door was shut tight, and it felt like he had vanished without a trace. I knocked on Gene's door later that day to ask if he'd seen anything. "No," he said. "It's like the guy just packed up and left in the middle of the night. I haven't seen him since yesterday." Sarah and I were relieved at first. Maybe whatever had been happening was over. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. Why would someone just leave like that? No warning, no goodbye, nothing. It was like he had just disappeared. And the worst part? We never found out what those noises were or why he'd been staring into our house that night. I can't shake the feeling that one day he's going to come back. And when he does, I'll be ready. Until then, I guess this will remain one of those mysteries that you just can't explain.